Did you know that filling your fantasy world with 15-syllable names spiced up with commas and hard consonants can leave your readers confused and disoriented and looking for the exits in your book? Or did you know that breaking the rules of your world once you've established them can completely throw off your reader's suspension of disbelief, even if you're doing it to better serve the story? Well, if you've ever tried your hand at world building before, then I'm guessing maybe you did know some of those rules, but what about the more fundamental dynamics of world building, when you're actually creating the world in the first place? In this video, I'm going to share with you the top 5 mistakes that I have observed beginning writers and even more experienced writers typically making, and specifically I'm familiar with them because I made them a lot when I was first trying to create a fantasy world for my original fantasy novel that I wrote about 15 plus years ago. Creating a unique, original fantasy world or setting is one of the most fun and fulfilling aspects of writing in the fantasy genre in the first place, but it takes a lot of time and energy and work to do that well. And unfortunately, if you include even one of the 5 mistakes we're going to cover today, it can completely undercut all of the other good work that you put into your world building and leave your readers bored or confused or disinterested in continuing to be part of this fantasy world that you've spent so much energy in developing. Now, I will say that even though all 5 of these mistakes are really, really important, the 5th one, the final one, is probably the most important because it really underscores and ties together the other 4. So make sure you stay to the end to catch that one as well. And with all of that said, let's get into it. Starting off with mistake number 1, no schmerps. Justin, I can hear you thinking from the other side of that screen. Yes, I hear you. What the hell's a schmerp? Well, no schmerps is a term that was coined to get at the idea of not unnecessarily fantasizing every element of your world, but instead to be more intentional about ensuring that you focus your world building energy on things that need to be unique and original, and let things that don't just be what they already are in our world that readers are familiar with. In this example, a schmerp is a small furry creature that hops around on 2 large back legs and has long ears and likes to eat vegetables and populate rapidly. Obviously a rabbit, but in his example, oh, maybe you change the fur to purple and you call it a schmerp. And that is wasted energy. Remember that every time you introduce a new unique element in your world to your reader, a new term, a new object, a new creature, a new place, you're asking them to spend mental energy figuring out what that thing is and then sort of placing it within the larger context of this world that you are introducing them to. If you make them go through that process and then at the end they realize, wait, that's just a horse or a tree or a doorway, and you just forced me to jump through the hoops of figuring out what it is when really it's just a different name or maybe a slightly different coat of paint for something that you could have just called a tree. That's an unnecessary level of friction and confusion that will slow down your reader's engagement with your world and very often will leave them frustrated. So instead, make sure that every time you introduce a new concept or term or object in your story, that it's something that is actually unique, that is actually exciting or different, and ideally is something that really serves your story or is an integral and necessary part of what makes your world different from ours. And doing that will keep your readers engaged and eager to continue exploring this world that you're opening up to them, looking for the next cool thing you have to share. But as bad as it can be to fill your world with schmerps, committing mistake number 2 can be just as bad because it absolutely breaks your reader's immersion in your story, and that is no copy pasta. So this mistake is kind of the reverse of mistake number 1. While it's true that we don't want to overwhelm our readers with a barrage of new terms and names and ideas, especially if they're being used to describe things that we're more or less already familiar with, to the same extent, we also don't want to bore our readers by offering them the promise of a unique fantasy world that actually ends up being filled with things that we're already familiar with because we've more or less just copied over, without changing significantly, lots of elements from our existing life and history here on Earth. Fantasy fans love being immersed in unique, unusual, creative, or exciting new worlds. It's one of the main reasons we read this genre in the first place. So it's really important that we actually deliver on that in our writing. This applies to obvious things like not just kind of taking carbon copies of famous places or historical maybe cultures or civilizations without at least making making some interesting tweaks or changes that play around with or subvert our expectations about those things. But in my experience, actually, it's some of the even more elemental things that can be the fastest ways to break your reader's immersion by just using them without adjustments. Things like units of time, measurements of distance or weight, etc. There are a few things worse for me than reading a scene where Finvar the Farseer tells his companions to meet him 5 miles outside of town on Tuesday, July 17th. So even though it can require a little bit of extra effort, I personally think that spending some of that energy on developing some different approaches to some of those common terms and phrases that are going to get used constantly throughout your story to talk about time, distance, calendar, things like that, can do a lot to make your world really feel unique and distinctive and avoid breaking your reader's immersion by suddenly like splashing that cold water in their face as they come across really common and familiar things that feel more like anachronisms that really don't belong in your fantasy story. So now that we've addressed all the copy pasta and schmerps, we need to move on to mistake number 3, which is no theme parks. Now, generally speaking, most world building begins in the pages of your notebook as you're outlining concepts or ideas that you have for places or cultures or periods of history, etc. And in that phase, it's pretty common and normal for the categories and definitions that you're beginning to lay out about how your world works and what makes it function the way that it does are kind of straightforward or streamlined or maybe tidy is a good word to describe it, because you're really just sort of sketching out your ideas. However, when we actually get into the later stages of world building, and especially into the writing phase, it's really important that you kind of dirty it all up and smudge the lines and blur things together to avoid creating that feeling of sort of an artificial theme park where things look good on the outside, but when you spend a little time in it, you realize that it doesn't really match reality because everything is just a little too neat and tidy and structured when real life just isn't that way. Don't just settle for the path of least resistance. Oh, these are the barbarian tribes of the north, and all of them want X, Y, and Z. Or, oh, the priests of the sun god are all like thus and so. Invest some time into creating differences and disagreements and factions within your cultures and your organizations and your places. Make sure that in almost no cases does everyone agree on anything, because in real life, no one ever really agrees fully on anything. Make sure that people change their minds or do things for apparently irrational or emotionally driven reasons that aren't always the most obvious or best choices. When it comes to your storytelling, make sure that the unexpected happens so that it doesn't feel like your characters are just kind of on rails through a world that is sort of like being on the It's a Small World ride in the Disney World, where like every time you come around the corner, everything in your world is like doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Bad weather, bad luck, and unexpected decisions from other characters and organizations and people groups in your world can and should be happening all the time in order to create that sense that this is a real living, breathing world that is happening irrespective of your story and your characters, and in many cases force your characters to experience and respond to and react to the things that are happening around them in the world. The more energy that you invest into kind of dirtying up and complicating the originally neat and tidy lines of your world building, the more it will feel like a real living, breathing place and less like a cardboard cutout. And one of the very best ways to make sure that you are not writing a big old theme park is by also making sure that you don't engage in mistake number 4, which is no stasis. As I've already alluded to, nothing in our world is ever really static. Just as soon as we feel like we've figured out how things work, it seems to be changing just as fast as we figure it out. And you should strive to accomplish that same feeling in your fantasy world. Technological breakthroughs, cultural revolutions, new ideas, new religious movements, wars, famines, natural disasters, all of these elements should populate the history of your world leading up to the moment where your story is actually taking place, but they should also be taking place while your story is underway. Change is inherently interesting. So instead of filling your world with these kind of static monoliths that have more or less always been what they have always been, be sure to include ways that the world is changing right now, and then force your characters to experience those changes and respond to them, to have feelings and opinions and maybe even disagreements with each other about what they mean and how to respond to them. But for as important as these 4 mistakes that we've already covered are, and they are very important, all of the work that we've invested into fixing them or removing them from our world building will unfortunately come to very little if we don't tackle the 5th and final mistake that fantasy writers most frequently make in their world building and writing. But very quickly, before we dive into mistake number 5, if you have been enjoying this video, if you found it helpful to you, then I would really appreciate it if you would drop a like on the video, maybe leave a comment below, tell me which of these mistakes have been most eye-opening or most helpful to you, and don't forget to subscribe to the Story Castle for more in-depth discussions of writing, craft, and story principles every week. Okay, so with no more ado, let's dive into mistake number 5, no history lessons. When we invest so much time and energy into developing this world that hopefully we really love, ideally if we're spending that much time on it, we should love it and think it's awesome. It can be really easy to feel the urge to include all of the amazing details that we have developed in our world building process within the actual pages of our story. In fact, sometimes it can feel like anything we don't include on the page in our story somehow is like wasted energy that we shouldn't have bothered creating or dreaming up in the first place. But in fact, it's really the exact opposite. All of the energy that we spend in world building is useful and important because it informs your perspective as the author. Even if a detail about a revolution from 1,000 years ago, or a famous artist, or some other aspect of your world's history or cultures doesn't necessarily make it word for word onto the page, it still informs the way that you write your characters and the way that you structure your scenes, because that broad tapestry is the world that you are writing in, and the fact that you know that stuff will inform your approach to your story, even if it doesn't get shared verbatim with your readers. Furthermore, stopping and breaking the flow of your actual storytelling by insisting on giving sentences or whole paragraphs of exposition to just tell your readers about this fact of this culture feels this way about this thing, or this place that they're in has a really interesting history because 3,000 years ago X, Y, and Z happened here, is the single fastest way to bore or irritate your readers into stopping reading your story. Because at the end of the day, for as much as fantasy fans love good world building, we're still there for the story. That's the main thing. And you can't disrupt or undercut the energy of your story just for the sake of sharing more details of this world, no matter how fun or cool or interesting those details might be. But I will share with you one trick, I guess you could say, that I have developed over the years that I think is a really effective way to give yourself more room to share more of your world without falling prey to this sort of boring history lesson pitfall. And that is to share details about your world through the lens of your characters. By describing your world building through the perspective of your characters as they barrel through the plot and try and engage the elements of your story, you keep your world building details relevant and you avoid kind of undercutting or unraveling the conflict, tension, and energy on the scene. If you've invented a really cool creature that you're excited to share with your readers, don't just tell us about it. Show us your characters having to run for their lives as that creature tries its best to eat them in a forest. Or maybe as they have to step in to stop a cruel merchant from beating one because it's too exhausted to carry his cargo, and then that leads to other problems because they get in trouble with the city guard, and so on and so forth. If you can't wait to share a fun or interesting location within the city where your story takes place, don't just walk us through it like we're on some kind of guided tour. Show it to us as your protagonist has to run through it looking for a place to hide, or as your main antagonist gives a rousing speech that triggers the city's population to rebel against the king. By tying the elements of your world building to either important moments in the plot or to your characters' desires and emotions, it keeps us as the readers engaged and fully immersed in the story that you're telling, even while you're taking time to show us or share with us aspects of your world building. And that is a really fantastic 2-for for one that gives you more room as an author to share all the cool work you've invested in your world building without breaking the flow of your story. And that is the single best way to keep your readers engaged and interested and leaning forward in their seats, turning pages and eager to come back for more. But now that you know how to avoid these 5 mistakes in your world building, you might be wondering how to actually write effective descriptions when you are up to the point where you are ready to share some of these world building elements in your scenes. Luckily, I have a whole video about how to write unforgettable descriptions, so if you want to learn more about that, you can check that out right here.